Great. Welcome everyone to the second virtual meeting of the New England Botanical Club. This is our 1146th meeting of the organization since the late 1800s. We're very excited to be connecting with everyone virtually tonight. It's obviously sort of a busy and momentous day, but it looks like we have a great turnout so far. So we're very happy to see everyone logging in tonight. I am Jesse Bellmer. I'm a plant ecologist at Smith College, the current president of the New England Botanical Club. I just had a couple brief announcements before I hand off to our introducer tonight and our speaker. I just wanted to make sure everyone's aware of our next virtual meeting at the beginning of December on Saturday, December 5th. We will be hearing from Dr. Anurag Agrawal, a plant ecologist, chemical ecologist from Cornell University, who will be speaking on monarchs in milkweed, coevolution, chemical ecology, and conservation. It should also be a fascinating talk, so we hope to see many of you back here at the beginning of December. I would also point out, one of the few silver linings of our current situation is this ability to reach so many people and bring so many people together for this type of meeting, something that probably never would have happened in person for us. So we're very excited to see such a large turnout tonight. We had over 100 non-member signups. We'll see how many people materialize given all the events of the day. But it is incredible to see so many people coming out for this, the important talk that we'll hear tonight. And normally we would, if we were in person, we would do non-member introductions, but with the current format and, upwards of 100 people maybe coming in from outside, we do not have time for that, but we would encourage everyone who is not a member of NEBC to stay connected, maybe get on our mailing list or join as we go forward with this format for the foreseeable future. We have an exciting lineup of talks this fall, and we'll have similar presentations next spring. So a chance to connect to some extent and hear some great botanical presentations. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Sarah Helm-Wallace, the Association Manager of the New England Botanical Club, and our member who suggested bringing in our speaker for tonight. And we're really excited about this topic and getting a chance to hear from Banu. So with that, I'll hand it over to Sarah to do the formal introduction.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Helm-Wallace, as Jesse said, and I'll be admitting people from the waiting room as I do the introduction, so bear with me here. I am the Association Manager of the New England Botanic Club, and I'm very excited to introduce our speaker tonight. Our speaker tonight is the co-editor of several books, a few of them being Feminist Science Studies, A New Generation, which is the book that put feminist science studies on the map. She is also co-editor of the forthcoming book, Meat, A Transnational Analysis, which looks at human, animal, and plant relationships and at the production and consumption of meat and its alternatives, from the vantage point of a wide range of interdisciplinary scholars working at the intersections of the sciences and the humanities. She's also author of several books, Holy Science, The Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, which was just published last year, Ghost Stories for Darwin, The Science of Variation and the Politics of Diversity, a book for which she was the winner of the Ludwig Fleck Prize in 2016, which recognizes an outstanding book in the area of science and technology studies. And as I understand it, she has a book under contract with the University of Washington Press called Decolonizing Botany, From the Herbarium to the Plantarium. So tonight's speaker is Professor and Chair of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department at the University of Massachusetts, where she teaches a number of courses that focus on the intersection of humanity and science. She has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Madras, India, and a PhD in Zoology and Genetics from Duke University. She was originally trained as an evolutionary biologist and plant scientist, and her pioneering research has made her a leader in the field of feminist science studies. Her work explores the philosophy, history, and culture of the natural sciences and medicine as they relate to gender, race, ethnicity, and caste, or inherited social and economic class. Her latest research rethinks the field and practice of botany in relation to histories of colonialism and xenophobia, and explores the wide travels of scientific theories, ideas, and concepts as they relate to migration and invasive species. So without further ado, it is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Banu Subramaniam.
So first of all, I'm so impressed that so many of you came out on a Saturday night. And secondly, can you hear me? Okay. And, you know, and a historic night like this. So I'm really, really grateful. So I first wanted to thank Marc Charpentier, who invited me on behalf of the Botanical Club. And I want to thank the hard work of Nancy Esther Smith, Jessie Belmer, and Sarah Helm Wallace in organizing this event. So I'm really grateful to everyone. The camera opens with an eerie, desolate street bathed in the shimmering hues of a dusky evening. Rows of squat wooden buildings frame each side. The wind howls. The music plays the discordant notes of foreboding features. Then the quintessential icon of the American West makes its appearance. A large, dried, brown, entangled ball rattles purposefully down the street. The camera follows the rattling ball as it rolls and bounces on and on, seemingly endlessly, with strange precision and a purposeful gait and an enlivened spirit. This scene is the classic archetype of the American West, and the hero, the rattling ball, the floral icon, is the classic tumbleweed. The rattling structure houses thousands of seeds that scatter about as the tumbleweed ball bounces along the path. It is worth noting that the tumbleweed, an icon of the American West, is not native to the US or even the Americas. Indeed, none of the classically quintessential American icons, the cowboy and his accessories, horse, cattle, and tumbleweed, are native. As Zadie Smith suggests, ideas of homeland are mythic, imagined concepts, purposefully created for imagined past, presents, and futures. The tumbleweed is in fact Russian in origin, commonly called the Russian thistle, having been brought to the United States by Russian religious refugees to South Dakota in the 1870s. And ever since, its phantom path has grown green with offspring as it has tumbled its way into the rest of the country. Why and how do some objects come to be beloved and to inhabit the iconography of a nation? The tumbleweeds of the West, the cherry blossoms of DC, the Georgia peach, while other objects remain resolutely alien, foreign, and reviled, such as kudzu, snakehead, zebra mussels. The question of what comes to belong and what does not is much more complex than mere geography. At its heart, the answer forces a serious reckoning with the histories of colonialism, conquest, and slavery. I want to acknowledge the immense relief I feel at the election results today. I do not want to minimize the incredible effort it took from so many of us across the country. Yet in 4 years, immense damage has been done. Federal policies have affected not only our cultural and social lives, but also our natural lives. And it reminds us that there is no separate nature and culture from politics, only nature cultures. Our moment should also be sobering. After 4 years of the Trump administration, a significant portion of the electorate, although not the majority, voted him for a second term. They welcomed 4 more years of the same. This should remind us that nothing is behind us. We have to confront it. We have to come to terms with a gross mismanagement of epic proportions that has endangered the health of the country, the health of its people, the health of its plants and animals, and the health of its environment. No doubt there are many complex reasons, but at its very heart was Trump's rallying cry to preserve a particular vision of America. The power of white nationalism is its power to transform a majority of the country into believing that they are victims with grievances, of transforming the powerful into the powerless, of creating fictional histories of glory in order to mourn the loss of a mythic past. This is particularly significant in a settler colony like the US, where a nation of white immigrants have anointed themselves the true natives to be the gatekeepers of this imagined nation. It is the reckoning of this history, this making and remaking of nations and nationalisms, that is at the heart of the issue here. As much for the nation as for the academy, the university, its disciplines and disciplinary formations. Botany is one such site. The tension around white national grievance is a tension around race. This matters because the tension around race is at the heart of our conception of the natural and the human. Scientific hierarchies of race that ranked human societies from higher to primitive orders provided the racial and civilizational logics for colonialism, conquest, and slavery. The racial logic in the great chain of being organizes all matter and life in a hierarchical conception of biology: human, animal, plant, fungi, bacteria, viruses, and so on. Racial logics and language undergird hierarchies of higher and lower organisms. They undergird the logics of taxonomy and systematics. To understand botany and its formation is to reckon with its deep entanglements in the histories of colonialism, conquest, and slavery. Leanne Simpson puts it well. Really, what the colonizers have always been trying to figure out is, how do you extract natural resources from the land when the peoples whose territory you're on believe that those plants, animals, and minerals have both spirit and therefore agency? What you do is you use gender violence to remove indigenous people and their descendants from the land. You remove agency from the plant and animal worlds that you reposition Aki or the land as natural resources for the use and betterment of white people. So what I'm going to do is do a talk in three parts. One, a brief introduction, a second part, some conceptual tools from the field of feminist science and technology studies, and finally a case study of invasion biology. So part one of coming to a life in biology. So I grew up in post-colonial independent India, and where in terms of the government, it was very much a government promoting science and technology and industrialization as the way forward for modern India. But in terms of growing up, one is very steeped in Indian mythology, especially the mythological stories of the Ramayana and Mahabharata. And in these stories, nature is enchanted. The natural world is enchanted. Trees can talk to each other. Humans and animals can communicate with each other. Animals and plants can communicate with each other. And each of the mythological characters is embedded in a vast natural imagination. And so growing up, to me, the natural world seemed very mystical, imaginative, where all things were possible. And then, of course, one has to go to school. And going to school in post-colonial India meant a post-colonial British education system, that it comes straight from the British, which meant that many of the textbooks really didn't deal with what might be local, but instead we were, forced to learn poems like the Daffodils, right? So it was a kind of Western education. And we were often studying poems about plants and flowers that we were never likely to see in our lives. Jamaica Kincaid, who is from Antigua, has written some about a similar dissonance she felt growing up. And this is a quote from her where she says, "In my child's mind's eye, the poem and its content," so she talked about having to learn Daffodils, William Wordsworth's Daffodils in school. "In my child's mind's eye, the poem and its contents, though not its author and the people through whom it came, were repulsive. I had no rational or just way of arranging and separating the people who created the things to memorize from the people who made me memorize wonderful things, whether they were about daffodils, heaven and hell, or just the River Thames. And in fact, you will hear many, many an Indian, that we know better British history than we know Indian history. And so there is something about the post-colonial condition that creates this dissonance. And part of the legacies of colonialism is that the local languages through which I knew plants and animals in the world around me, I suddenly, when I went to school, had to learn the Latin nomenclature. I had to learn the English words for them. So there is a serious alienation that education and the sciences produce in going through a post-colonial education, because it separates life and the knowledge of the everyday life from the so-called science that we were all forced to study. And Jamaica Kincaid, in her novel Lucy, has this very funny scene where a character finally comes to the US and sees this field of daffodils, and she says, "I wanted to kill them. I wish that I had an enormous scythe. I would just walk down the path, dragging it alongside me, and I would cut these flowers down at the place where they emerge from the ground." I mean, it seems rather violent, but I think it sort of expresses that once you look back on the kind of alienation that these legacies of colonialism have forced on generations of students who want to understand the world around them, that it says something about how long these legacies continue, and in a way how violent they also are. So, and part of what she says is, this naming of things is so crucial to possession, a spiritual padlock with the key thrown irretrievably away, that it is a murder and erasing. This legacy of capturing and renaming nature leaves the post-colonial writer in a position of having to negotiate the terms of taxonomy, struggling to articulate new relationships and meanings in the tired language of empire. And so to some extent, for a lot of us, having to translate what nature meant to us in the languages that we grew up with, there is sometimes English is not adequate to express that. So again, the sense of alienation that emerges. And so after my undergraduate, I came to graduate school in the US. And coming to graduate school, I mean, everyone was very well-meaning. And so my point is not about individuals, but about how the educational system is set up. And the normative experience is, of course, of usually a white American who, had nature all around, that there was a creek in the backyard or a forest in the backyard. And nearly all my fellow classmates had extensive experience wandering in the woods. They knew the plants and animals around them. They had been taken to hikes right through school and through their parents. They went camping, right? And so they understood the natural world in ways in which an urban Indian like me did not. And this, I know, is also shared by, for example, some of my friends, African-American friends who grew up in this country, who again, in urban areas, who again have a very different relationship with nature because of how US society functions. And yet the ideal botanist that all our professors assumed was this botanist who had been immersed in a world of nature, growing up. And so those of us who did not share that quickly internalized it as our inadequacy, our intellectual inadequacy, rather than understanding that this was a cultural issue of the tools that we came with were not tools that were useful in the framework that graduate school was conducted in. And there's a wonderful phrase by an anthropologist called Sharon Trawick, who has a book called Beam Times and Lifetimes, where she's talking about the culture of high energy physics. And so she says, science claims to have no culture. And so as an anthropologist, she is studying the culture of no culture. So part of her work is describing how the culture of science functions. And it's really a culture that has no language for culture, right? So there was no way for me to understand what was happening in graduate school, no way from my professors to understand what was happening, and no process in graduate school by which this conversation could happen. And so this is part of the reason, why for me, it's like we really need, when I talk about decolonizing, we need to decolonize the process of how we produce generations of botanists. So giving you just very sort of key ideas from the field of feminist science and technology studies, or feminist SDS. And at the heart of it is the idea that science is not outside of culture, right? That we often like to think that somehow scientists, when they enter their lab or enter their field site, can put culture behind them, and then they enter as neutral bodies. And this is the claim that science makes all the time. But there is a vast literature out there, and if anyone emails me, I'm happy to suggest some readings, that has shown time and again that scientists are citizens of a particular historical time and a historical cultural and political situation, and they look at data about the natural world from that perspective. And so scientists are human after all, and they bring those cultural biases with them. And so rather than thinking of science as outside of culture, we need to understand science as within culture. And part of the argument is that if we do this, it will make us better scientists for us to recognize the biases that we are bringing to the table. Of thinking of what are the languages we are using, where do these ideas come from, what are the histories of these ideas, that these are questions, if as scientists we asked of the work that we did, it would actually make us better scientists rather than more subjective scientists. So this is at the heart of the claim of feminist SDS. So really, if you take a concept like race, it's not a stable concept. It has changed over time. So there's a wonderful book that talks about how the Irish became white, right? The Irish were not always white. So a lot of so-called biological terms, race, gender, the gene, native, alien, are terms that constantly changed, and they change because ideas move from science to society, back to science, from nature to culture, back to nature, right? And so the argument is, rather than understand a gene as a natural object or a cultural object in this false binary of nature and culture, we should understand nature as something that is produced through the traveling of ideas and theories from nature to culture and back again in an endless repetition. There's a well-known sociologist, philosopher of science called Bruno Latour, and part of what he argues is what the academy has done is it's created this binary of nature and culture, of non-humans and humans. There are some disciplines that study the natural world and non-humans, other set of disciplines that study humans and the cultural world. So we purify knowledge into these ontological binary categories. And at least on my campus, one is on one side of the pond and the other fields are on the other side of the pond, right? But he's saying we could do whatever we want in our academic knowledge formations, but in the meantime, in the world, there's work of translation happening all the time. Things like climate change emerge that are shifting plant lands and our landscapes all the time. So we might want to purify all as much as we want in creating these pure disciplines, but really the world outside is begging for interdisciplinary frameworks to understand how nature cultures functions, how humans and societies work together to reshape the natural world all the time. And finally, I want to give you actually a couple case studies to illustrate this example. And the first is looking at the field of invasion biology or bioinvasions. And here, invasion biology, for the most part, thinks with the figure of the native. So what we say is this plant is native, this other plant is alien. And part of this new work, I'm trying to figure out what if we thought from the point of view of the migrant or the refugee rather than the native? So in trying to rethink plant ecological frameworks from a different figure than the traditional one of the native. But I'm going to play out what this, the figure of the native does to this field. And so, thinking in terms of, Darwinian evolutionary frameworks of these categories of the alien, the native, the naturalized, the resident, and the exotic. In part, this work came because I was collaborating on a set of experiments in Southern California, looking at native and exotic species and their relationship with the soil communities. And I began to see, I was reading the newspapers, and, this was a period of another wave of xenophobia in this country. And I was just struck by the vocabulary that I was seeing in popular culture, and thinking scientific frameworks alongside these scientific cultures. And so the book that Sarah mentioned, Ghost Stories for Darwin, one of the case studies in there is looking at invasion biology. And part of sort of what I discovered in looking at the histories of evolutionary biology is I had only studied the science of evolutionary biology. No one had ever talked about the politics of evolutionary biology. So looking at that history, I was really shocked the degree to which all the key figures, the key theorists, the key biologists were all deeply embedded in the politics of eugenics, some for, some against. They had complex ideas about how the science connected to the political project of eugenics. And of coming to realize that this idea of cultural diversity and difference mapped on to ideas of variation in nature. And if you actually read the debates of that time, this is the debate that they're having, is between the natural and cultural world. And yet all the political part of it, I had never studied in any of my undergraduate or graduate biology classes. And I came to realize that something is lost when we do not understand the whole picture of where ideas come from, in understanding Darwin's own development of ideas from alongside, Malthus on one side, of Adam Smith on the other, and how those ideas shaped alongside geologists like Charles Lyell, right? All these ideas shaped where he comes from. And so understanding science from an interdisciplinary perspective allows you to recognize the ways in which natural and cultural formations are always in the history of science. They've always been talking to each other. And so I use the history of eugenics, the figure of the ghost, as a way of talking about the kind of violence that has been caused in the name of science. And so thinking about invasion biology, the whole idea, again, looking at invasion biology, really the idea of the native is this idea of whether nature is in place or out of place. And we have the same idea in the human world, like thinking of Edward Said here, or the natural world, out of place. And the idea of nature out of place comes from John Henslow, a British botanist, who was trying to categorize British flora. And he realized that if he had to categorize British flora, he had to be able to say what was British and what was not. And so emerged this idea of this is native, this is alien. And looking at the history of ecology and history of biology, I think by now, historians of ecology argue that colonialism really was fundamentally an ecological project. If you look both at the goals of fundamentalism, which was really about resource extraction, the history of conservation biology is rooted in colonialism, in wanting to keep that resource going so the extraction could be continuous. And fundamentally, as Leanne Simpson started on, it was about imposing a Western model of how to do agriculture, of how to do horticulture, of how to do animal husbandry. It was an imposition and of growing the crops and animals that was needed, for the colonists. So fundamentally, in terms of the cutting of forests, So you look at every stage where people make a very compelling case that, that we need to understand colonialism fundamentally as an ecological project. And in this project, the colonists felt completely comfortable, right? They took whatever plants and animals they wanted to the colonies, and similarly brought things from the colonies, back to the center. And so if we look at the history of botany in 1800s, 1900s, for example, in the US, someone like David Fairchild himself brought something like 112,000 species into the country. And so the USDA at that point would send biologists to the rest of the world to bring things that they saw as interesting and to bring back, to the US for whether it looked interesting or it was agriculturally useful for, any number of reasons. And so there was really open borders at that time. And so in the 1890s, you have a case of someone who decides to bring every bird mentioned in a Shakespeare's work into Central Park. And so you see 600 birds introduced into Central Park. And then we begin to see the challenges of immigration into this country. We begin to see the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, but it comes a year after the state's quarantine law. So looking at this history again, the ways in which we are talking about foreign plants and animals go a step in step with how we talk about foreign people. And then, of course, we have the Immigration Act of 1925, which limited entry of all European immigrants, or it limited the entry of European immigrants into the country. So coming from that history to the present, if you look at the definition of invasive species, it is, according to the USDA, it is fundamentally a definition that talks about invasive species as introduced species. So by definition, invasive species have to be foreign. A native species cannot be invasive, even though some may go out of control. So here is a children's book. So I'm just going to give you a sense of the popular reach of invasion biology. Here is a children's book on exotic invaders, killer bees, fire ants, and other species. Alien species are infesting America. In fact, there are now many children's books on exotic invaders. So we start this education very, very early about the foreign. Tinkering with Eden. Again, this is a very common idea that at one time there was Eden, a beautiful nature, and then the exotics and the aliens came and brought Eden down. The language of battle and war against alien invasion, and of scientists as warriors against invasive species, about the threat that invasive species bring to the world, and how we can have the year's most terrifying new thriller of invasive species. All species evolved to survive, one has evolved to conquer. So again, you see these very colonial language about the ways in which we talk about invasive species. Aliens from Earth, again, of the idea that they do not belong here. They are not from this nation or indeed this planet. And nearly always it's connected to ideas of globalization and biosecurity, and that this invasion is because we do not have borders. And so invasion biology is very much predicated on the idea of borders and boundaries. So when I began this, I started looking at titles from newspapers and magazines. I'm just going to let you skim these. So it's too bad we can't have a back and forth on this. But part of what was striking to me here is none of this tells you they're about plants and animals. So the creepy strangler is actually English ivy, not some creepy human strangler. And so again and again of recognizing these headlines, which are not about plants and animals, but a classic fear of the other, the foreign, something not from here. And I began to see parallels between how we talked about humans and how we talked about foreign plants and animals. They're all unhygienic. They look weird. They're taking over everything. They're doing it very silently. They're stealth destroyers. They're indestructible. And again, this classic third world figure of the oversexed female who over reproduces, of aggressively and prolifically, and then the fear of miscegenation, that they're here to say, this is irreversible damage and they are destructive and they've come into this country unwelcomed. My favorite headline is this: they came, they bred, they conquered. And as the war, the war on terror evolved, I began to see parallels between how we were talking about foreign plants and animals and how we talked about foreign humans. So just like Homeland Security made us all citizens that called up and reported anything suspicious, we now have apps that can, in terms of citizen science, that can report alien insects or alien plants. We can call a number and do just what we would do with humans. And just like we have militarized people around the borders, similarly, this idea of the green patriot, that we need to militarize environmentalism and conservation biology because things are that dire. So again, the language of militarization has pervaded the environmental sciences. And of course, the profound irony in all of this is about who the natives are. Right? So the natives of this land have been colonized and segregated into reservations. So it is the white immigrants who have called themselves the new natives. So the history of the U.S. makes this hypocrisy that much more poignant. And I'm sure we'll talk about it in Q&A. My point here is not about saying there aren't problems with our environment, that we have destroyed the environment, that the situation is dire, that through globalization, through colonization, through all these different histories, we have done tremendous damage to the environment. But my point is, by making this about invasive species and organizing, Saturday trips to the forest where we pull out invasive species, that is not going to solve the problem. The problem is really about development and greed, rather overdevelopment. And so unless we get to the proximate causes of what has caused the damage to the environment, I feel facile language of invasive species and projects of pulling them out of our backyard do not do enough. And what they actually do is a kind of theater of the foreign that makes us feel like we are doing something, but really the proximate causes are something we never get at. I want to give you another quick example of plant reproductive biology. This is the opening line of Londa Scheibinger's Nature's Body. Hermaphroditic plants castrated by unnatural mothers, trees and shrubs clothed in wedding gowns, flowers spread as nuptial beds for a verdant groom and his cherished bride. Are these the memoirs of an 18th century Academy of Science, or tales from the boudoir? And part of what she's arguing is that they are, tales from the Academy of Science, but really they're also tales of the boudoir. And part of it is because when botany became a science, it happened around the same time as the sexualization of plants. So the scientization of botany and the sexualization of plants, happened at the same time. And the scientific revolution and the revolution in sexuality and gender came together to elevate plant sexuality as a central focus of botany. And so to be a Linnaean taxonomist was to believe in the sex life of flowers. And not only were his plants sexed, they actually became human. And so if you think of his famous Systema Naturae, it's founded on the idea of the nuptiae plantarum, or the marriage of plants. And if you look at, it is all over in plant reproductive biology. If you look at the terminology and the frameworks we use, which are very heterosexual. So you have to have male trees and female trees, or male flowers, male flowers and female flowers. Or if they happen to be hermaphroditic, which is, over 85% of flowers are, we have to talk about the male parts and the female parts, right? But this whole terminology comes from a heterosexual imagination of husbands and wives and marital beds. So if we look at the terminology of Andrecius and Gynoecius and Androdioecius, it is all about describing human sexual biology onto plants. And in fact, many people, when Linnaeus first published them, found this really pornographic and were horrified, sort of at this language. But part of what is striking to me is how diverse plant reproductive systems are and how arcane our languages. And it's really about having to create increasing categories to accommodate the splendor of plant reproductive biology in this tired language of males and females and husbands and wives, because that's the vocabulary we inherited. And so part of my project is trying to imagine other ways in which we might think about what it is plants do that are not constrained by Victorian puritanical ideas of human sexuality. And in fact, that terminology and the classification lives on today, as Dobzhansky argues. The fact is that classification of organisms that existed before the advent of evolutionary theories has undergone surprisingly little change. The subdivisions of animal and plant kingdoms established by Linnaeus are, with few exceptions, retained in modern classification. So again, these legacies of colonialism, and I'm not going into Linnaeus and his how not only with respect to sexual biology, but also with respect to ideas of race. And in fact, race is one of the categories in the ways in which he classified organisms. So sex and gender and race are tightly interwoven in the histories of colonial biology. And finally, I just want to make this point about, I have talked about the human, about the us, about the we, and we talk about the Anthropocene. But one of the things that I have been really reminded of again and again in doing this work is that when we talk about colonialism, we are talking about one set of people who colonized another nation, took their riches back to their countries, and really, one would argue that colonization underdeveloped countries. So if you look at a country like India, it was something like, I don't know, something like 27 or 30% of world GDP before the British, and it was brought down to 2%. So that's the work that British colonialism did in the hundreds of years that they were. And since then, this is a different set of questions of post-coloniality and the third world and the after effects of the legacy of this colonialism. But now somehow we seem to be in this point where we want to talk about it as the Anthropocene, that somehow a generic human has caused the damage to the planet, when in fact I would argue it's these histories of the colonized nations who have brought us here. And so it's really striking to me that when we talk about which humans benefited then, it's a particular set of countries. But when we are talking about blame right now, it is about it, it's something that has to be shared across the world. And so to me, again, a reckoning with the colonial histories of botany should make us pay heed to who the human, the us, the we are in the Anthropocene through colonial times to the present. So finally, I just want to summarize some of the key ideas I feel I'm trying to present here. One is that part of what botany did is that it produced an abstract universal language. The power of it is that we can all speak the same language across the world, but it removes context and politics from it. It alienates some groups of people whose language this is not. And one of the questions I would like to pose is when we talk about ethnobotany, we are always talking about sort of the indigenous or third world countries and that their botany is ethnobotany. But the question of whether Western science is itself an ethnoscience, and why should we not call it an ethnoscience, just like we call other kinds of botanies? After all, many cultures had sophisticated understandings of the plant worlds they lived with, the natural worlds they lived with, and all that rich understanding has been erased, has been invisibilized. And so perhaps part of the project is about giving value, to indigenous knowledges. Second, as part of what Western academic systems have done is have taken integrated interdisciplinary understandings of, like, for example, when think of the Renaissance. But what we have done is that we have vivisected knowledge into disciplines such that had I not ventured into gender studies, I would know nothing about the politics of eugenics. I would know nothing about the history of some of the key players and the ways in which their biological theories of evolutionary biology were shaped by certain kinds of political questions. So it has made me a better biologist to know this history. The disciplinary specialization is partly botany emerged, algebra emerged. So each of these sciences emerged during colonial times because there was a particular purpose for it. And so botany is the way it is because those were the tools that were necessary for empire. So again, it makes me, ask the question of what are other ways in which we can think about the natural world that were not useful for empire, but that might be useful for thinking of a more productive future for humanity. So what are other ways in which we could organize the ways in which we understand the natural world? And then these disciplinary genealogy, and part of what botany does once it becomes a science is it becomes canonized, and then we reproduce it again and again. And part of the botanical language of empire is really of understanding botany, of understanding colonization as fundamentally an ecological project. And so we don't naively talk about invasion biology as something new that has happened to this world, but really are honest about the histories of a plant mobility and the role of colonialism in that. And part of what botany does is centers a Eurocentric view and strips non-Western ideas and concepts of gender, race, class, nation haunt botany's vocabulary, and we continue to teach our students and continue to talk in those same languages. And those extractive economies of empire continue to shape modern science because those are the tools we're given and those are the tools we use in the ways in which we think about contemporary botany. So part of what I'm arguing is that we need to reckon with the histories of the colonial roots of botany if we want to think about confronting the real problems that face us, and those are immense problems indeed. So I will stop there for now, and I'm happy to have a discussion and dialogue.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Banu. That was fantastic. Sorry, you prefer Banu.
Yeah, sure.
So I just want to open up the floor for anybody who wants to ask any questions. Please post them in the chat. You can either post them privately to me, I'm the moderator, or to everyone. You have those options. So we already have a couple questions. So if you don't mind, I'll just go right ahead and start with the Q&A. Let me pull this up here. Okay. So the first one is let's see, how do we begin to deconstruct the barriers that allow scientists to separate their work from history and context? Do we inject more interdisciplinary work on history and ethnic studies into science education?
Um, yes, and I think it has to happen both ways. So I feel that in the humanities, so part of what, I'm trained as a biologist, but I teach in a women, gender, sexuality studies department, and it is in the College of Humanities and Fine Arts. And so I often will get students, and so all my courses have enough content in biology in them. And sometimes the people who police it the most are the students who say, I'm in a humanities class, why are you making me think about, genetics I studied in high school or that I took in my genetics class. But it's really, the point for me is that sometimes I'm appalled at, how can we be good citizens today if we do not understand, science and technology, both how they work, but also, what policies should be like. So I sort of feel there is something really lost in the degree of specialization that we do for students, even as early as the undergraduate level. And so I really want more science in humanities courses, just as I want more humanities in science courses. And even the professional schools, the pre-med advisors and the pre-law advisors, all of them encourage students that to be a well-rounded thinker, to be a well-rounded doctor, a well-rounded botanist, being a well-rounded thinker is really important. So yes, I would totally second what you're saying, that we need more interdisciplinary education. And in part of what has happened at UMass is because there is this rightful concern that people need to graduate, some of these interdisciplinary requirements have actually been diluted in my time there rather than enhanced.
Okay, the next question is, I totally understand the very real issues with the language, terminology, and approach to invasive species that you laid out in this talk. As someone who has been educated in this colonial system, and I have this issue too.
Me too.
Yeah, okay, I guess most people, according to what you said tonight. As someone who has been educated in this colonial system and therefore might be tainted in the effects of certain species on the health of various natural communities, how might you suggest ecologists talk about these issues, which in this person's opinion are very real?
I think that's a great question. And I really don't want to present myself as someone who has the answers. I'm sort of beginning this project. It's been a life's work, things I've been thinking about a long time. But one of the key lessons I feel I've learned in looking at the history of science is that nearly always at any historical moment, there are always competing theories, right? So even if we look within biology, there are biologists who suggest, rather than this litmus test of where is your country of origin, let's look at life histories of plants and let's look at what their prognosis is. So for example, Mark Davis, some of you may know him at Macalester College. And so they proposed this idea that if you look at, so they proposed, I think, 7 different ecological traits of a plant, and that it's a very small subset that's really likely to be invasive. Right, so rather than use this language of invasive species or foreign species, and therefore and there are ecologists who would say we need to cut off all foreign plants because you don't know who will become invasive. There are many biologists who say we can use our ecological knowledge to make predictive arguments, right? And so we can focus on those species. And so it becomes about traits of those species, not because they are foreign. So there's certain kind of work that I feel xenophobia does here that in part feeds the larger xenophobia in the country. And so that's one proposal. And there are other proposals that people have made. And one of the things that really strikes me in these histories is, so if you take something like kudzu, right? So it becomes like, oh, this is a vile plant, we need to eradicate it. But when you look at the history of kudzu, kudzu was first exhibited in one of these World's Fair here. And then the USDA paid farmers money to plant them per acre, right? And again, in a lot of these invasive species, there is a history that we have produced the conditions for what is happening now. But very rarely do we to inform people of those histories, that these are really invited invasions. We have created the conditions of possibility for what is going on. So again, I feel that if invasion biology, if we think about ecosystem damage and reframed it with what is happening in this country, we can focus on ecosystem damage. We can focus on plants that are likely to become invasive without using the xenophobic lenses of foreign species and native species.
This kind of is on the tails of that, and this is my own question. You speak a lot about terminology, and I'm just curious, what kind of terminology might we use instead of, well, obviously not alien, but instead of invasive and things like that. But also, going to your example about the terminology we use for the male and female parts of a plant, when plants are most plants are hermaphroditic in some respect. What are some new reclassifications of those as well, or new terminologies that maybe we could use that you've been thinking about and researching?
Invite me back in a year.
Okay.
And maybe I haven't, that's the part that I am just beginning to work on. In part, I just learned the history of how things came to be. I haven't gotten to the part of reimagining them, but if anyone has ideas, please email me. It's stuff I'm thinking about, but I'm just really struck by these complex terms we have, and it's all because we're stuck with this binary language. If to say 1 male, 3 females, it's that archaic language that shows up in these complex terminologies.
Yeah, that'll be a fascinating thing for you to research. So looking forward to that. So I'll keep going here. The next question is, how do you actually feel about the chat is blowing up, so keeps moving on me. How do you actually feel about the negative effects of invasive species such as Phragmites, giant reedgrass, that wipes out a lot of native plant habitat, as in the Northeast US?
So it's like, I do think there are, we have damaged our environment, but I just don't find the language of foreign species and invasive species useful for what the project that we have ahead, right? So we're all focused on pulling, manicuring our gardens to put only native plants there. But in the meantime, the scale at which ecological damage is happening is much larger than us. And this is, for me, too narrow a focus for those larger changes that have happened. I mean, people have been moving these plants across for hundreds of years. And often when something takes off, the question isn't, where did it come from? Often the answer is, it's been there a long time. The question really is, why is it taking off now? What have we done to the environment that the species that was in very low numbers before has suddenly now taken off, right? So I sort of feel we need to ask those political and social questions of why it is some species have, taken over, and getting to those proximate causes will help us actually solve the problem, rather than blame foreign species for being foreign and pulling them out without changing any of the conditions of possibility that allowed them to take off.
Yeah, so it's like, we've got a problem, now let's fix it.
Yes.
Instead of placing the blame, which is a very human, or at least a very American characteristic, very colonial characteristic, I guess. Let's see here. Okay. How might a new non-gendered model of describing the haploid stage of plants expand our understanding of plants?
Can this person say more?
It's
an intriguing question.
Yeah, can you say more? John, if you're listening, John Berryhill, can you say more about that? And I'll move on to the next question. Are there any botanists working to develop a less European-centric system of naming plants? One that incorporates non-European ways of organizing plants. Is new nomenclature important for decolonizing botany?
So I think this has all been relegated to the field of ethnobotany. of people who are, who chronicle other systems in other parts of the world, other cultures that understand the world differently. But again, this is part of my, is that, oh, that is ethnobotany. This is science, right? And that's part of, the question I'm posing, is this also a Western ethnoscience? And is there something to be gained in all of us learning these other ways in which people understand the world, or at least introducing them in our biology classes as legitimate ways of understanding the world. I think the little that I've been reading about the history of classification suggests that there's this debate of naming has gone around for a long time, that a lot of people felt the Latin names, that the colonial roots of that. And so like sometimes they were named after scientists, and usually it is the European scientists who were there, and then the species names comes from that. And so that some people have proposed we should do it on where it's located. So it says something about where things originated. So yes, I think there's a rich conversation in the biological world about naming and whether we should name things differently. So I think there's a rich debate.
Yeah, and yeah, part of that question was, is new nomenclature important for decolonizing botany? And I would think that you
yes, absolutely.
say yes. Yeah, without question. Yeah, okay. Let's see here. Somebody mentions that for plants, we could use staminate and carpellate instead of male and female. We can also use.
I think that if you look at the roots of staminate and carpellate, they're equally sexual.
And then his other comment is egg producing versus sperm
producing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think these are really interesting ideas of, of being creative in thinking of other ways that might, to some extent, sever those histories and those logics. I think that's the point, is that maybe with new vocabulary, it will open new kinds of theorizing. It will enable new ways for us to talk about the world and actually open up the field of botany rather than it being stuck in these colonial legacies.
Mm-hmm. And again, this is, so you're speaking to a botanical club for the most part. So you're going to have these questions, a lot of these kinds of similar topics here. But this is an interesting comment. All of the multi-syllabic definitions of plant sex might be summarized as plants are gender fluid, much like.
Exactly right. That's exactly right, Elaine. I could not agree with you more. And, so part of what I'm interested in this project is also looking, starting with plants to describe this sexual tapestry of splendor and maybe taking it back to humans, right? So just as it came from humans to plants, maybe the reverse can happen as well. That's exactly right.
Okay, let me see. There's somebody who'd like to ask a question verbally.
Yeah.
So, Foster, if you're ready, I'll find you and unmute you.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Banu. This is Frosty Levy from Pop Gen at Duke.
Oh my God, hello.
How are you?
Good.
If you look at Charles Elton in 1950, he was talking about invasions not as a value of good or bad, of process. It really wasn't until the late 80s or early 90s that the concept of good, bad, xenophobia, all that took root. And that, as you've mentioned several times, replaced the emphasis on our degradation of habitat. But once that happened, you have to take into account, why did it take off so much? And partly that was because many agencies in the government were much more comfortable with saying, oh, our bad species from such and such land has destroyed our country, rather than that we've destroyed this habitat and look what's happened. So unfortunately, some influential biologists and botanists were involved in this bait and switch process.
I completely agree with you, but I would not present it as benignly, as you suggest. I think that when you look at the history of science, part of what you see is during times of xenophobia, other than invasive species, you'll have germ panics, um, you know, panics of different kinds. So there's something about the foreign when that becomes an object of fear, it transcends species. And so you begin to see, so this is not new, the idea of a fear of the foreign plant or animal. There have been fears of foreign plant and animals and bugs and bacteria for a very long time. But I think in talking to some environmentalists and conservation biologists, the argument is that this really helped mobilize environmentalism. It brought a lot of money, you know, into fields. And you're absolutely right. It became this platform where every environmental organization, the NSF, every state has its invasive species management, right? So it became this platform that poured a lot of money in. And so part of what I do in my book is trace the history that you are talking about. But I sort of worry that in this expediency of that it captures everyone's imagination because people get scared, and that's the, you know, the point of this language, that we are ultimately doing great damage in promoting the xenophobia that invasive species language inevitably does. So I don't find it quite as benign.
Oh, I agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
Also, we were coming out of a period of 8 years politically, not very unlike what we're coming out of now.
Yeah.
But we're also seeing a similar thing, I think you may agree, with the pollinator problem, where we can plant little pollinator gardens while we destroy most habitat.
That's right.
And everybody can feel good about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's yeah, well put. Or the way in which the virus becomes the Chinese virus, right? That it's easy to racialize something as the other, which is what is all of this, rather than saying, how is the world organized such that everyone goes to the cheapest place to produce something, and then everything is transmitted to the rest of the world. And of course, you're going to get a pandemic, right? So we don't ask those difficult nature cultural questions of how one set of issues automatically translate into, you know, lots of other kinds of issues.
I don't want to monopolize the time, but
I'll catch up. I'll look you up and catch up with you. So
I grew up on the streets of the Bronx. You weren't the only one at Duke who was out of place.
That's great. But we didn't talk about this then.
No.
Thank you, Foster. So we have one, it looks like just one more question. If I missed anybody's question, please just repost it because there's a lot going on in chat right now. So the last question that I see is, do you feel that we changing our land management techniques as we become more aware of these problematic social and ecological frameworks, do you feel that we are changing our land management techniques? Can you point to any particular projects that have successfully applied this theory to practice?
That is a great question, and I should have a good answer, but I don't. But I think there are a lot of good examples across the country of people who are taking these questions seriously, who are not posing a separation of human and non-human, but thinking about how do we as multiple species live in a world together. So I think there are lots of examples. And what I'm talking about really are the main normative ways in which we talk. But as I was saying, at almost every period in history, there are always people have other imaginations, doing a lot of good work.
Yeah. Okay, one more question. I completely agree with interrogating our framing around plant nativity in regards to xenophobia, and with focus on gardening displacing focus on systemic problems. But where is the balance with also understanding and remediating that the reason we don't see native plants is because we are colonists? Where is the balance? Jessica,
We
can
don't
you
see native plants is because we are.
expand? Getting to know native plants is decolonizing our own lens.
Ah,
Okay.
so this is the other question that I find very interesting of what is a native plant? It's something I didn't go into here. Is it something that's here 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years? Who decides? Is it about how well integrated it is into a particular ecosystem, which a so-called lot of invasive species have become integrated, and so-called native butterflies now need this invasive plant because to me, I sort of have also a larger, question of how we are defining these things. And I've still not seen a good project that has gone around talking to biologists of how they define, so what is the definition of something that is native, and when is something considered considered foreign? When is something naturalized and integrated? So to me, there's something about the premise of the idea of native and foreign that does not sit well with me. That said, the question that you are talking about, I mean, if you're part of what you're asking is about, so for example, indigenous botany. So as someone like Robin Kimmerer, for example, if you have read her, I think, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot to be gained in understanding how native peoples understand land, understand nature, understand plants, the ways in which plants are integrated in indigenous cultures. So there is a completely different vocabulary there. There's a completely different relationship in how plants and animals work. So it's not just a botanical that if I botanically understand native species, that the project is done, right? So that part of what I'm suggesting is that we need a different relationship with knowledge than we currently do in the field of botany. But I agree with the spirit of the question, I think, as you're framing it.
Okay. What about the word wild? What sort of connotation does this have?
Yeah, so this is so even, I don't know if you've been following with the coronavirus, there are all these, these headlines of nature is taking her revenge, that that there is a rewilding of our cities as animals have, these pictures of animals walking through Main Street of various towns. But, at the heart of all of this is this idea that humans are separate from nature. And I think we really need to sort of revisit that question about what is wild and, what is domesticated. So we need to rethink those histories. And I agree about the sort of the militaristic way in which we talk about unwanted plants. And there are, in fact, there are many biologists who would argue that without, in some of these desolate places, without these species are actually rejuvenating certain landscapes, and without them there may be nothing growing there. So there are some people who understand invasive species as the species that are helping us through climate change. Nothing else will grow there, but they grow there. So there are lots of if you look at the literature, people have other kinds of ways in which they're reframing these questions. And this, especially with climate change, what is adapted? What does it mean to be adapted anymore? If I live in a place where the environment is completely different, should it be any surprise that there are shifts? And what does it mean to keep wanting to preserve the natives there when the conditions of their adaptations don't exist anymore? So I think climate change, especially, to me, has thrown such a wrench in these questions of invasion biology, just because of fundamental ecological and evolutionary questions of adaptation in a changing world.
I'm going to throw another question in there, if you don't mind.
Sure.
you know, thinking about migration in general, I know several of our members are interested in assisted migration of plants because they can't move north or wherever they need to go fast enough to keep up with climate change. And thinking about humans and migration, at least in the current world in which we live, with climate change, humans will have to migrate in order to get to water sources,
Right.
And in order to, you know, get to the more rich areas. I'm just kind of talking, and I just wonder if you can kind of speak to, you know, humans and migration and plants and migration, and what you're thinking about as far as climate change goes.
So with respect to humans and migrations, I mean, it's like the vast majority of, you know, human migrations have been forced migrations, either, you know, through circuits of slavery or economic necessity, because, right? And we, like even today, we know the ways in which powerful countries intervene in other kinds of countries that create the conditions that some groups have to flee, right? So I don't want to go into geopolitics, but so much of human migration is really a story of politics. And that, again, if we created the proximate causes that didn't force people to leave, they may not leave, right? So again, the solution is always, we need to close the borders to people coming into us, into our countries. Like, you know, all rich countries have that, when we are not addressing the issues of why people might want to move, because there is too much violence, there's, you know, or exploitation of different, you know, of different kinds, an economic regime that powerful countries have supported for a long time because it behooves the, you know, the richer countries to do that. So geopolitics is, you know, at the heart of so much of that. And so again, rather than is that again and again, we will never solve the proximate causes. And it just becomes about vilifying people and closing borders. So it parallels very much the ways in which we talk about plants. The other question you're asking, I think, is a really interesting one that I've been thinking about a lot, is that if climate change is happening, how do we create a world so that plants are adapted to the temperature conditions or, you know, soil conditions? I think that, you know, that's a really interesting question, but it's all, you know, one always worries, given the history of ecology, the kind of hubris humans have had in, you know, doing all kinds of things and then making a mess of it. Yeah. But I certainly think it's something we should think about, consider, experiment. You know, I'm all for that. I don't want to hold on to some idea of purity, because I think we are beyond that.
Yeah. That is, I guess, probably the crux of the matter, of the question of assisted migration. Are we going to make a mess of it if we try it? But we kind of have to try it because climate change.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay. So I think that's all the questions. There is somebody in the chat who has thoughts on settler colonizer perspectives and conservations. There's a link there. So, you know, I don't know how we can get that link out, but if you want to scroll through the chat right now and
I got it.
Check that link, that'd be great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So a lot of compliments. So thank you again, Banu. This was a really great talk and a great Q&A. And I think Jesse has something else to say. So.
Yes, just thank you again. This is a fascinating talk. A lot of really great ideas to introduce to the audience here tonight. But thank you, everyone.
For inviting me again.
Yes, thank you so much.
Bye.
And we hope to see many of you back next month for the talk on monarchs and milkweeds.